Can we start before? Why don't we go ahead and get started? So, welcome. We're going to talk about the global business context. One thing when we speak to CEOs and talk about the drivers of a fractured world in our shared future, some of the things that come up constantly and consistently is technology in all of its various forms, protectionism, the media, divides along gender, along race, around culture, and trade. These are just some of the things that are shaping CEOs' views, and it's rare to get a group of leaders in a room talking about the future of all of these factors and others on their business and what it means for the business community. So we want to basically unpack a little bit of this today with our panel. I'll remind you that this session is on the record, and I'm going to start by introducing our panel. Right to my left, Francisco Gonzalez, who is Group Executive Chair of BBVA, Spain's second largest bank. We've got to the far, far left, Bill Thomas, who is Chair of KPMG International. We've got Mr. Parekh, who is CEO and Managing Director of global consulting services firm Infosys. And we've got Linda Yaccarino, who is Chair of Advertising and Client Partnerships at NBCUniversal. So I want to get started by, thinking about the last 50 years and who's been the role models for what it means to be a chief executive officer. And we have sort of iconic names like, Jack Welch, Steve Jobs. But what about the next 50 years? How does technology going to change the nature of how we define what it means to be a business leader? And for that initial question, I would like to tip off to Mr. Parekh.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where people are watching. The next 50 years, so first the last 50 years, we've had some incredible leaders for organizations in the public sector. The next 50 years, there are three elements which strike me as being critical. First, we're sort of moving from a linear setup to something which is a more lattice or connected setup. And so anyone who wants to succeed in that needs to be connected in multidimensional ways through all activities at all times. With the way news moves, with the way business events are moving, with the way events within our companies are moving, I feel this sort of constant connection is a critical element of how someone needs to work, thrive, and survive in the coming years. The second really is to constantly think of themselves as a challenger and not think of themselves as anything remotely leading the pack, because there's so much disruption that one is likely to be challenged and disrupted at any given time. We have so many examples of that from the tech world. And the third really is pushing a reskilling agenda within the company and within the environment. Those are things which are going to create value for the company, for the business, and for the community as a whole. And those are people, I think, that are going to be remarkable in the coming 50 years.
Mm-hmm. I like the point you make about how you have to think about the challengers and you're likely to be disrupted at any time, because Bill, you said that you see technology convergence, ushering in a new sort of range of services and companies and things that people haven't really ever thought about before. Can you just talk a little bit about what that means for your industry and what examples are you seeing and how are CEOs having to kind of navigate this new reality?
Well, look, I think that's absolutely true, Jackie. Every year we do a survey of 1,300 CEOs, and so so we get from that sort of where they're at, what their insights are. And interestingly enough, to Salil's point, in that survey that we did most recently, the CEOs that were surveyed, they said, look, lifelong learning is as important for us as it is for any member of our team. And I think it was something 70% of them recognized that the skills they had today, they are going to have to shape and improve. I mean, I look at myself, I'm 50 years old. I think that my, the number of times that I'm going to have to reshape the way I think and the attitude that I have towards the sort of how to succeed in today's marketplace is going to turn over several times. But to your question, one of the other things that came strong out of that survey was this whole concept of convergence, as you described. And what that was really was to say, look, 5 years ago, if I was a CEO of a major organization, I kind of knew what my competition was, I knew what my market was, and I could play the game. Here are the rules. Today, with the speed of change and the amount of disruption being created by technology, you're kind of in an unknown scenario. Who are my competitors? Where are they coming from? There's certainly the traditional ones, but there's a whole pile now that are coming from a different spot. And then what's my market? So people saw that as either a threat or a huge opportunity. And interestingly enough, in that same survey, CEOs saw that they wanted to be the disruptors in their industry. They knew that technology was going to disrupt them, but they wanted to be the disruption itself. And in order to succeed, and this is the convergence piece of it, they had to do what they were really good at and partner or ally with somebody else who was going to fill in the pieces. And I've seen that in our business. Historically, we would have said, if we're going to offer a solution to a client, we would offer it soup to nuts. We would do everything from start to finish. Today, there is no way that is a long-term successful venture. We will partner with sometimes 2-3 different organizations that are experts in components, and the collective solution that we're providing is what is expected of us, and what our clients around the world are telling us that that's what they need. So that was way up high on the agenda of the CEOs we surveyed.
And how does that look? What does that look like for financial services, Francisco, when you talk about new entrants, and what is the future sort of that space in the thread of what Bill just described?
That is the big question. What will the banking system look like in 5, 10, 15 years from now? What I know that everything is changing, and we particularly have been working in what we call the long digital journey for 10 years now, and we are learning every day. Because I remember when we started this journey, we put our focus on creating the platforms, both hardware and software, and over time you have the cloud, you have completely new languages, everything has changed again within a period of 10 years. And now we are in the second generation, working the second generation platforms. Hardware has disappeared. We have given the hardware concept to a third party. We got rid of the hardware because it's in the cloud. Everything is changing. What I know is that we, as a bank, have to transform the bank into a digital company or service company as soon as we can. That is what we are learning. And frankly, what we are learning is that our customers, as long as you provide them the right platforms, the right services, they are extremely happy. We now have, this year, we will get a point where 50% of our customers will be digital. Our NPS, Net Promoter Score, has gone up dramatically. Now it's 60, 65 in the banking systems. It's a very high number. The revenues coming from the digital customers are 2.4 higher than the customers working with the physical world, with the branches. So everything is changing very rapidly. My view is that today there are 20,000 banks in the world. 5 years from now will be thousands. 10 years from now, I don't know, less, a fewer number, and 20 years from now, probably dozens. That is the real problem. Something big is going to happen because you have to confront problems of system risk, financial stability, consumer protection, the innovation. This is a very complex task. It takes a lot of time, a lot of efforts, and a lot of determination. Banking system is going to suffer a lot.
So you'll see effectively shrinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no place in the digital world for 20,000 people, even for hundreds of players.
Actually, just a quick follow on that point, because if you look at the displacement of, jobs, I think it was PwC said 40% of jobs will be displaced in 15 years. A lot of that's coming from financial services, notably in the U.S., just because of the retail nature of that market, and also just because a lot of it's so routine. Do you see a difference in how the U.S. operates, Francisco? Is Europe ahead? Is Asia ahead? Who risks falling behind in the scenario you just described by region?
Today, the Chinese have taken the lead, frankly. When you look at Alibaba and Tencent, they have created a huge companies, and they have been the ones who have first entered into the financial world with a lot of success. I don't say, I can't say that success can be reproduced in the Western world because there are a couple of differences, but the trend is inevitable. So why not the Amazons or the Facebook, those guys, and a variety of startups can be successful? Why not? They will. So we as a bank have to set up the right benchmark. For me, I am not worried about my peers, my conventional peers. For me, they are the old guys. You know, I am worried about the new guys who are, you know, the giants of the net, either the giants of the net or some startups. This is the benchmark we are working with, and that is we want to, you know, to speed up our process in order to be as efficient as the other guys are. And we are not. I am seeing BBVA as a bank anymore. I am seeing BBVA as a digital company who combines, who have information, and that information can be turned into a mortgage or into different services, because the boundaries are blurring, and we have data, and data can be turned into different things.
Okay, I want to just turn briefly to the hunt for talent, because I think that's something that's impacting all industries, and it's a real concern. So everybody basically, whether you're chemicals or consumer, you know, they say they're a tech company, we're a tech company. It's not just about Silicon Valley. Maybe Linda, I can punt to you, but you know, the question is, can nations and the private sector train people fast enough to meet the demands of a robotic and automized economy?
So specifically to your touching upon the hunt for talent and the endless search for the talent that you want to come into your organization and attract them when you're competing with companies that are digital natives or tech-first companies. I think the main thing that my company talks about all the time is the need to focus on changing or transforming our internal space or our environment to reflect what these new graduating students or experienced folks that we want to attract from, whether it's Facebook or Google's of the world or the engineers, and reflect an environment that they're looking for. It's something at NBCUniversal that is a 94-year-old company is not used to doing, not used to focusing on reskilling. Reskilling at a company was something that, because our business hasn't really changed it's changed more in the last 5 years than it changed in the prior 50 years of our company. And we're largely in the content development, distribution, and monetization business. Imagine how much that didn't have to change until the technology impact has completely liberated the consumer. So having our office environment and our philosophy and our work plans reflect what it takes to bring in those customers, something that we really focus on and spend a lot of time doing.
So, what do you think, particularly in your business?
Yeah, I think the critical element is, you know, people talk about not having enough individuals to fulfill requirements. I think we've got to start to think of different groups of people who can help. So first, there's a program in the UK on using apprentices. There's programs in the US on community colleges. We are involved with several of those programs. There's programs where people who are having a second career, so maybe from armed forces, maybe from other areas, coming into the workforce. The trick is to find ways to skill individuals in short bursts that can support the need that you have today. And in any case, we find the need changes rapidly. So it's not even that you finish your training and then you're good for the next 20 years. It's almost every 6 months, you've got to find a skill that starts to support the client work that you're doing. And this is a sort of ongoing evolution that's required in the reskilling. So there's lots of availability of talent possibility which we're not tapping into, which we should, and in many cases at Infosys we are. And then there's many ways of training and reskilling, which is more rapid and not sort of a monolithic one that helps you.
I think the idea of recruiting and pipelining talent has changed dramatically because your reaction time has to change dramatically, and you are recruiting or digging into different pools of candidates because you're looking for a much different skill set than you had in your pipeline, which is in a much traditional format historically.
You know, Jackie, just to jump in here, in that same survey that we conducted, you know, right after the conversation on technology disruption, those same CEOs are saying, look, like, we're not shrinking our workforce, we're hiring. And our biggest concern is availability of the right type of talent. And I think it weighs right into the conversation on, and actually we were talking about it at a breakfast I was at this morning, you know, it gets to the conversation on, you know, is the educational system, is that sort of producing the types of individuals to succeed in today's world? Have we rethought those models? And are we really looking at, you know, this historical way of thinking on how we educate our kids as they're ready for their professional lives? Is that, does that need a refresh given it's been the same for a long, long time?
There's that, but there's also the question of how do you make yourself attractive as a business, you know, to the talent that's out there. So I remember at one of the tech summits I attended in the fall, one of the big U.S. Huge manufacturing company, the head of CTO, their CTO was saying, you know, it's hard to get, we're starting a drone program, we need technologists, we need data scientists. They don't want to work for us because they all want to work for a cool company in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you position yourself as a business to attract that best talent?
Very important question. According to my experience, it's impossible to turn an incumbent into a digital house with conventional people. You need to bring the digitals. And that is what we have done over the last years. At the first, we made a mistake trying to go forward with our own people, no, we failed. So rapidly we tried to bring digital people from the digital world and blend that people with the bankers. And now we are in some way creating a new breed of professionals because we need both, you know, bankers and digitals. And a new breed of professionals is coming up. So this is the most important part of, you know, changing a company. It's not a technological problem, it's a corporate culture problem and having the right people and the right organizational chart. One idea about jobs, I think it's a big mistake to protect jobs. You have to protect people, not jobs. Going back to the coal industry is not the solution. You have to train people and to protect them because you can't go to the past. No, it's a big mistake.
Sorry, what do you mean train people, protect people?
Train people is giving the people the opportunity to be trained again and to giving the opportunity to go into the new market with the new capability, new skills. And if it's not possible, and sometimes it's not possible, giving them, you know, the subsidies and or unemployment payments or whatsoever in order to protect social.
Okay. One of the areas of disruption is gender. And I think if you look at the displacement potential because of technology, women are going to be disrupted the most. I think it's 57% of, you know, women in those types of jobs are the ones most at risk. So, I mean, when you think about all of the advancements we're making, I mean, how does that change the discussion around the gender debate? I'll open it up to whoever wants to take that. I think,
Well,
Linda, you had some thoughts.
I feel partly responsible, obligated to jump in first, if you don't mind. But it is something that, you know, personally and professionally, something that I'm quite involved in and passionate about, because to your point, which I'm happy to hear that a lot of people are, I think it was PwC who came out with that study, but roles that females in the workforce have traditionally or a majority have taken, whether it's been some type of administrative role or particularly in customer service, are going to be impacted and have started to be impacted already due to technology impact and mostly because of automation. So it's something that when we talk about, I think what you mean by talking about protecting your people is to be able to give women specifically in our organization or our collective organizations the opportunity to kind of cross-pollinate or to be trained and to move into a different role, and make sure you look at their skill set and not their job that they're doing today or have done, even if it is for several years, because age is a challenge for these women who have been in these particular roles. So take the time and the opportunity to protect them, to train them, and to move them into a new area. And it's something that's very, very important. And in light of the moment in time that we're living in, whether it is the Me Too movement to the Time's Up initiative, it's something that we have to do to protect these women that are in our care, in our organizations.
Bill, I know you've been recognized in your firm for initiatives you've taken on the diversity and inclusion topic. You know, what are you seeing sort of in your business and business more at large around the topic of, you know, women in the future?
Yeah, look, I think this is the displacement you describe takes a really difficult issue and makes it even more difficult. Obviously, if there's a disproportionate potential for displacement, then you've already got a challenge in almost every major organization around the world in terms of gender parity. And so, you know, although as parents, and the responsibility sort of falls on all of us as parents, any of us would look at our daughters and say they deserve every bit the same chance to succeed in any organization that our sons would. That's an easy, understandable conversation to have, and yet, you know, all of a sudden they get in the workforce and it's not that simple. So you know, you stand back and you recognize as leaders in your organization, regardless of the level that you're at, I think not only is it the opportunity that you have to your kids or your loved ones, it's the responsibility that you have as a leader to stand up. And a couple things I think are really critical. One, recognize that historically we've said, look, this is a conversation that should be had by women, about women, for the benefit of women. I think it's absolutely not. I think it's a conversation we should have, all of us, about all of us, for the benefit of all of us, and then be really clear and concise about what is it that you're trying to solve for. Deal with the inherent bias that's absolutely readily apparent in your organization, and work backwards to the origin of the problem as opposed to solve it. You know, for us, for example, it was how to promote individuals into the partnership. You don't start the year before they become partners. You start, you know, well earlier in their career when their original job allocations get made, and they have the equal and best opportunity to display their skills and show their stuff. And then all of a sudden on the doorstep to partnership, you've got an equal fighting chance. So, I mean, it's leadership, it's understanding that that recognizing there is a challenge. And number three, I think, is not being shy to be honest and truthful, even in the face of some discomfort amongst your team.
I mean, just on that front, you know, since we like specifics, can any of you, you know, tell the audience, you know, what is your breakdown of your sort of operational committee or your management board on that front in terms of gender and or diversity and inclusion?
We have advanced very much in the board. Now, 35% of our board is made up of women. We didn't advance very much at the management team because it takes time. 54% of our labor force is made of women, which is fantastic. But we need more time to, you know, to give our women more opportunities, but you have to be in favor of that movement. You have to love that a woman occupy better and better positions. And I remember, I am 73. I remember 40 years ago, when one woman was pregnant. Wow, what a problem! We will lose some. Now it's completely different. When one woman is pregnant, I am very happy because, you know, it's a new opportunity for a woman to be happy and to bring kids. And we need kids, by the way. It's very important. So it's very important to be determined and to understand that 50% of population can be put aside. we have to leverage on women because it's a big opportunity for the bank. And that pays off.
All right. Salil, actually, sorry, I haven't heard from you for, I mean, what do your numbers look like in your board?
So for our board, we have a strong representation of women. On the management committee, we are starting to work to build it. At the graduate level, we have over 50% of our recruits are women. We need to find ways, and especially in the way we develop our own business in the digital world, to make sure that that gets the right level of attention. We also look at diversity across nationalities. We work in over 40 countries. And so we need to start to look at how we become much more of a global business than just a business originating from a country. So we have a lot of things we need to work on. But we have the building blocks and certainly the mindset to get there. And starting with our board, a good representation of how that change is happening.
Right. So it's kind of using diversity as a tool to reinforce your global business.
Exactly.
Got it.
Not even a tool. I think it's really the if I can call it the foundation of the infrastructure. What we need is not sort of a lever.
Got it. One thing, there's 2 points big buckets I want to touch on, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions. You know, we talk about the gender, but there's also sort of just the broader social responsibility. And I want to talk about, you know, where the private sector steps in the absence of nations. So, for example, you know, how is industry becoming the beacon of leadership on, you know, topics like the environment, you know, equality in the workplace, on these kinds of issues where you've seen in some instances a retreat? You know, is this now becoming the role going forward of the private sector?
Yeah, so I might jump in on this one and say, look, I think and it kind of sort of puts together a few of the things we've been talking about. But if you look at today, you know, by the year 2020, 50% of the world's workforce will be made up of the millennial generation. If you want to attract, and it was a little bit to what makes one company attractive relative to another. If you want to attract millennials to your organization, then teaching them a craft is one thing, but that's in and of itself not enough. You have to articulate who you are, what you stand for, what's your purpose, what do you care about. And this gets exactly, Jackie, I think, to the heart of your question, which is, you know, if an organization cannot articulate the answers to those questions, if it isn't greater and broader than simply the bottom line, then you're going to leave yourself at the mercy of the whim of a population today that I think that's exactly what they care about, and so, you know, articulating your purpose, understanding that you have a responsibility to your team and therefore to your community. We're in, you know, we've got 200,000 people in 152 countries. I guarantee you that we feel incredibly responsible to those individuals, and if we're responsible to them, we're responsible to the communities that they come from.
And to add to those comments, I think if you take that in this purpose-driven world that we live in and look at it through to your question of the private sector's responsibility, when you add to that the opportunity for the consumers themselves to have such a big, constant, always-on voice, it resonates to them, for them, the companies that are fulfilling those purposes to them. So there's a business impact, which is very, very beneficial. And I think the companies that you'll see as leaders today, that will be the leaders in the next 50 years, to your original question, of those companies that reacted to the responsibility to the ultimate decision maker, which is the consumer today, and actually benefited and fueled their entire organization.
And the only thing I would add is social media gives everybody a voice. Whether you want to listen to it or not is a different issue, but everybody has a voice.
In fact, I would add, you know, yeah, I'm especially proud of the sorts of things we've done at Infosys. There's a clear responsibility that I think private sector businesses have, whether there's a vacuum from public sector or government or not. We have involvement through a foundation which is massively funded within India, and we have equally a foundation in the US where we're working at very different levels with states like Indiana or North Carolina in real community outreach. And I think these are things in India we're doing loads of work across, and there's a host of issues that we need to address there. So, and it's not, I think the government in both of those instances is doing a lot, and so it's not the political vacuum you were referring to, but equally there's something that private sector companies need to do more of. And it's especially for the reason that was mentioned in terms of that's what our employees want to do. So we have 200,000 employees. They want to make sure that what they're doing every day is in some way also benefiting the community around. And that's a good enough reason, but there's a larger impact that we can have, which makes a huge difference.
But isn't it also the case that just consumers are becoming more particular? I was with a retail executive yesterday who was saying that, the question was, how much of this is being driven by investor and consumer demand versus, your need to do good? And, there is a marketing aspect, is there not, to sort of social corporate responsibility? Sure. Right? Okay. That was more a statement than a question.
No, I feel companies are responsible in that regard. And in our case, for example, we have operations in the developed world, Spain, States, other countries, but also in the emerging countries. And in the emerging countries, we feel more responsible because we have to fill the gap. And we, for example, have set up a foundation, Open Foundation, with $200 million euros back in the day, 10 years ago, in order to give small credits to poor people. And now we have 1.8 million customers. Many of them have been able just to set up their own businesses. And I feel very proud of having those sort of activities, which are very difficult to address, but at the end of the day, you are helping a lot of people.
Two more things I want to hit before I let the audience. The one thing that kind of confounds everybody a little bit is just this, dichotomy you have between the way global economies are going, stock markets are booming, everything's booming on paper, right? But then you have this crappy political landscape. And as a business, how do you kind of reconcile yourself to that fact that you've got, on the one hand, strong economies, strong stock markets, but, we could go to war any minute now. How much of the geopolitical is going into some of the strategic thinking that, you're having with your boards?
The main problem, at least for us and other people, is the geopolitical risk, because now we have problems everywhere. And the world is changing very much because the power is shifting from the Western to the East, the Eastern. China, India, there are many countries which will take the lead over time, and geopolitical risk is on the rising. So for us, what's happening in the States, your country, in Europe, and the other countries is mandatory.
Okay.
I would add to it, I think that risk is massive, but not quantifiable, and so it's not easy. So the planning scenarios are quite, they have big volatility in the planning scenario. So there's very much discussions in the board, but these are not, I would say, risks which if people looked at 10 years ago, there was ways you could plan scenarios around it. So here, these are more, again, disruptive scenarios if they come about. So there's a little bit more of some level of planning, but another level of sort of working with the environment to ensure that there's sort of least impact if something happens.
Okay.
Yeah, in the survey that I described, number one risk, geopolitical risk from those 1,300 CEOs. That's very different than a year ago. Second thing I'll say is, to me, I would argue, imagine what the economy could do if there wasn't this. Because what this really does is create uncertainty, and the one thing that uncertainty does is have people sit on their money.
Is there sort of like a lag effect where is everybody sort of poised for the geopolitical to actually catch up to the market factor and the economy?
Well, we think it's a little more of a hesitancy to act, to your point of whether it's the private consumer themselves sitting on their money or companies. themselves, so it's a hesitancy. And it makes you just take a pause to maybe challenge to be a little more thoughtful, or you're a little more hesitant to be as bullish as the data would be telling you now. So if you have the macroeconomic conditions where you have all these lead indicators that are telling you things are good, let's go, you just have that hesitancy or have that conversation now that you might not normally would have about the what if.
Right.
What's our contingency planning?
Yeah, the world is a little confused because, Mr. Trump is is against trade. Apparently, the Chinese are open. The world has changed completely, and so the geopolitical risk has risen very much because nobody knows where we are.
Right. Since we're kind of talking about geopolitical, I mean, let's talk about how the global business map might be redrawn. I mean, someone mentioned China as, one of the huge, emerging powers, in the business sense. With economies in India, wealth in China, wealth is growing, the technological footprint it's growing. There is a, not even a concern. I mean, company executives say that China is poised to surpass, or at least, meet the rate of growth in terms of advancements that the U.S. is meeting. How will the map be redrawn, do you think, going forward, with those two factors in mind? I mean, Salil, do you want to try that one?
I think with respect to China, I think everything you say is absolutely valid. The progress is massive. And the fact that I think the population, so much of the population has moved out of poverty to really genuine middle class or better is a huge testament. I think for India, it's sort of starting off. There's been a lot of change over the last several years. There's further boost to the change, and that's growing quite nicely. However, the European and the U.S. economies, or the North American economies, are still massive economies, which have a huge amount of innovation, growth, and dynamism. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's a world which is many players are going to be making an impact. There's no sort of everything in the West is going to come down and the East is going to rise. My sense is the West is still extremely strong in so many dimensions. But there are these two really big countries coming up. And then I would add this, there's a lot of activity in Africa which should not be ignored, and there's a lot of movement there. And I think that's going to start to become individually as countries, but even collectively, an emerging force.
Sorry, can you just expand a little bit on the Africa point? What are you seeing specifically that we need to watch for?
There are large countries which are making a difference. There's change within many of the countries which is coming to the fore. I think there's activity across the continent which is more and more stabilizing. So it's not the scale that we see in these other geographies in terms of economic activity, but it's starting to come together, and so it'll become important in the coming years.
I hear what you're saying about Europe and the U.S. still dominating in many ways, but I mean, when I talk to the CEOs of telcos, for example, and they look at 5G, they say if you want to really see where companies are advancing, you go to China. When you talk to the global head of a biotech, and they talk about research and development advancements and research and AI, whatever, I mean, you go to China. So I do wonder, how that will get calibrated in people's minds. I mean, do any of, Francisco, do you have any thoughts about where the balance of power will sort of reset in the world?
For me, there's no doubt that China, in general speaking, as I said before, power is shifting from the power and development. It's shifting from the Western world to the Eastern world, no doubt, because they have a lot of people, and people matters, and some country has a lot of big demographic dividend. So it's a question of time. And the story says that empires go up and go down, and in my view, it's going to take time, but no more than a couple of dozens of years. So China is an incredible power, they are expanding their power all over the world, buying up everything. Sometimes those buys are not linked to profitability in the short term, but other targets. So the world is changing, and the Western world has to wake up very soon, very quickly, in order just to compete.
I keep saying I'm going to open the floor, but let me sneak in one more question. Sorry, I'm just so curious. I want to talk about Me Too, and just, practically, and Linda, I know you have some thoughts. You had a great example about NBC and was it the Golden Globes?
Yes.
What have CEOs done to within their own companies to reflect that movement?
Well, I think that activity or momentum is just beginning, which is great because at least it's beginning. Okay, so that's a good start. But a couple of weeks ago in the U.S., we aired the Golden Globes, which was one of the first big award shows of the season, and all of Hollywood decided that they were going to acknowledge the time that we were in with the Me Too movement transitioning to the Time's Up initiative and wear black. And there was a big sense of responsibility on NBC's part because we were broadcasting it, and we wanted to make sure that we acknowledged and were very respectful in the messaging of the movement, but simultaneously delivered an award show to the audience who wanted to see it. That being said, what was really fascinating, for the first time certainly, that I've been doing this for a bunch of years, and for the first time, there was so much activity right a couple of days leading up to the live show for companies changing their advertising copy or their advertisements that they wanted to air within the Golden Globes. Now imagine, it's a live show, huge ratings, but huge social community going on while the show is being aired. So a lot of companies took a beat and looked at the copy. It wasn't necessarily that it was there was no custom copy that had anything to do with Me Too, but it was more about CEOs and CMOs, who I do a ton of business with all the time, taking a second look and seeing if their copy was objectifying women or in any type of unintentional or unconscious bias that we talk about could in any way be interpreted by the audience that it was being disrespectful or not acknowledging the Me Too movement in any way. So it was really fascinating, caused for a little craze run up to airtime. But things were even moving during the show based on speeches or announcements that were going on. Because obviously now we live in a real-time feedback world when we're watching Twitter, looking at Facebook, and seeing what our consumers or our audiences are saying. But I have to say, while that was really astounding to go through that for the first time, it was actually exciting that as now NBC heads into the Super Bowl in about 10 days, and 4 days later start with the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, that we are working with a lot of our clients who are actually going to take a much more aggressive frontline approach to making sure that particularly with the competitive nature of sports and the opportunity to bring people together on the field or the court, that we're going to have much more specific messages that are supporting equality and parity.
That's really interesting. Just that cognizance, of being aware of the messaging in the advertising industries. I wonder in your industries, how is that manifesting itself in terms of this movement? It's a very powerful movement on the workplace from day to day. What are you guys seeing?
I think we've not seen any activity within our employee base, but I think there's a huge level of awareness that's come about, and I think you can see that across in any interaction. Sort of when I meet with employees in small groups, or in larger town halls. This is something that is top of mind for employees. And it's also an awareness broadly outside of the work environment, which I see in any of the interactions. So no question that that's something which has become critical for anyone who's involved in any level of activity that connects with large numbers of people.
Okay. So I think at this point, why don't we take a few questions or comments? If you could just identify yourselves.
Hi, Tim Moen. I'm the Chief Executive of Global Reporting Initiative. Thank you for a great panel. I wanted to return to Jackie's question on corporate responsibility and ask the panel to address it from a couple different angles. We talked about it mainly from the angle on the war for talent. But we hire these millennials in, and then we give them these soul-crushing jobs, and they don't actually get to express cause at work. So how do we engage especially young people in cause at work once we get them in? And the second angle I would ask the panel to talk about is the external to the company angle. With Larry Fink's letter, BlackRock's letter recently saying, all of my portfolio companies better be looking at this. Is that really affecting business? Are we seeing a trend from the investment angle that's demanding corporate responsibility?
Yes, I can jump in on I'll give you one example, Tim. I think, and I think CSR is very different than what we're talking about. Like, 10 years ago, CSR was what you needed to do. And I think community leadership is demonstrably different. CSR, you can have a policy and say we're doing the right things. If you want to be a leader in your community, that's something totally different. One thing we did in one of our countries was essentially recognize that we were going to support individuals, like in their day jobs, to be leaders in their community. So historically, we'd always written checks. And anybody and everybody sort of in this room can write a check. But if you stand back and say, how do we help you as one of our individuals on our team engage in the community in a way that is important to you? Whether we teach you soft skills, interpersonal skills, governance skills, communication skills. And then you go out into the community, you engage in a way that is, use those skills to better yourself in the community in the pursuit of a passion that you have, not a passion that I dictate, a passion that you have. And if you do that, in this particular country, we had 8,000 people. If you do that 8,000 people from coast to coast, then all of a sudden you stand back and realize that as an organization, you're making a movement. You don't do it to get the headlines. You don't do it to take out a full-page ad in the national newspaper. But I can tell you a couple things. One is the engagement that those teams have to be able to, that they have for that organization that allows you to do that on the top of their desk as opposed to the side of their desk or nights and evenings and weekends. That was unbelievable in terms of the difference that it made. And secondly, the aggregate impact on the community was incredible. So much so, and in this particular instance, what we did is we embedded it in everybody's goals and objectives, which was very confrontational in the beginning, and had individuals years later coming back and saying thank you, because this is one of the most rewarding pieces of my job, and I feel incredibly lucky to be able to do that today in this environment. So I think if you go at it with the right intent, so it's not about the headlines, it's about being a leader in your community and engaging your entire team to do that. I think the dividends are long-term, but they're incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other points?
Thanks. I'm finding the discussion fascinating. I am Arti Takurdin. I am a young global leader, but also the CFO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. I'm also a millennial. And I have to say that one of the biggest frustrations for me is, whilst it helps to have the community building and responsibility angle already embedded in the organization, and it's incredibly good. And I am really I'm a fan of the environment being ready to receive millennials. I really feel it's a mindset shift and more an issue of culture in the organization. And that's massive for your own organizations. I come from a small organization, and we've managed to shift the age group of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The average employee is 37 years old. So it's run by really, really like-minded people, I would say. But that's massive for your organizations, and I'm wondering what global cultural shifts you're making.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I think corporate culture is very important, and if you want to be a successful company, you have to look at the society. You know, in the past, there were, and there still are a lot of what we call bad profits. Bad profits are the profits were based on lack of transparency. And now people have a lot of information, and you can, design your company on bad profits. So you have to be extremely transparent. I'm talking about a bank in this case. Extremely transparent. You have to provide the best prices, and you can't have a conflict of interest. I mean, what I'm seeing from a bank perspective is that we will be on the cloud. We'll have a big platform providing services everybody, everywhere. But we can't produce our own products. We will have to pick out the products wherever they are, probably in the startup world, to package those products and to offer the best products and the best prices to our customers. So you have to gain the trust of your customers and be very transparent, extremely transparent, and giving your people, the possibility to work in a company which is loved by the society, which is not easy in the case of a bank. You understand that, but I don't think you can be successful if you not provide those values to your own people and to your customers.
We're kind of wrapping it up, but I have one question. One thing we didn't really address is fake news in the media, and that's pretty important because that social has the potential to really shape the narrative of a company. And the example that comes to mind, I think of the United Airlines dragging incident and sort of how that resonated really around the globe and, created a huge headache for, that particular CEO. But these are, the tweeting and everything, this is all sort of adding up to be, a pretty important issue for how you position yourself as a business, right? So I guess my final question would really be, how are companies adjusting to that new reality? Maybe, Linda, you can kick us off on that.
Well, we all tend to throw around the new phrase fake news in a variety of ways, but it's a very complicated issue. So a complicated issue to solve for, right? So the immediacy of the news and the potential of it going viral, as we call it, like the United Airlines example, I think is actually just one of the bad outcomes because you can't really control all of your employee activity when you have hundreds of thousands of employees. It was unfortunate, it was wrong, that's going to happen. I think the more complicated issue when it comes to fake news is that the younger generation really doesn't experience or consume news with the same filters that what I would call traditional news or older folks, maybe some of us up on this panel, were once raised, whether you had a news reporter, a news presenter that you trusted and that you received your news from, those largely don't exist anymore. So as a company like NBCUniversal that has one of the largest news footprints in the world, and certainly the largest news footprint in the US, you have to constantly be looking at your news organization and your filters for disseminating and really taking that responsibility of leadership very seriously. But how do you educate a younger generation about news literacy? I do a lot of talks about to younger folks, be careful what you share. Where are you getting it from, right? So I think that, there's a big spectrum to fake news. It's what are you disseminating? What are you sending out? What's catching on with consumers? Because you'll receive a video and you're there today sitting, is this real or not? What organization did this get published from? But the younger generation does not differentiate. Look, they're used to seeing, someone's, phone cam on site somewhere telling them what's going on, and they take that as real news. So real news and education and discipline is very, very important. Not to mention in the spectrum is, all the social and technology platforms experiencing a coming of age and their responsibility about disseminating or being a platform for disseminating news. I could do a whole nother panel.
I was going to say the only thing I would add to that is because on the content side, it's going to be really hard, and it's going to be hard to differentiate as to what is fake, what's not. But even in that environment, as a leader of an organization, perception or reality, you've got a challenge. So if you don't have a social strategy, if you don't have a social media strategy, if you don't have a ways of or a means of dealing with that, then that's something that is necessary to invest in and invest in heavily today, because at some point in time you're gonna face it head on.
One last question, because we didn't actually address head on the Trump effect. And when we talk about sort of the political, environment and geopolitical that we're operating in, and very quickly, can you give us a sense of, is this raising awareness about a lot of the things we talked about earlier in terms of, the responsibility of corporates and the private sector to do good? Is he actually, in some strange way, good in that way? I know it's totally left field, but we gotta say Trump. He's still might come here.
Is that every panel we have to say Trump?
No, but he's a big word.
I don't know if it has anything that pushing you to do good. I wouldn't say that, particularly for I could speak on behalf of Comcast and NBCUniversal. It's in the core DNA of the company for many, many, many years. But working at the company that was the presenter of The Apprentice, and him being part of the NBCU Peacock family for quite some time, I could say on behalf of our company has nothing to do with an urgency to do good. I think everything we talked about, cultural changes, impact of the purpose-driven economy or society that we live in today is really what's pushing us.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. Well, why don't we leave there? I'm going to let you guys have the final word, but I'm going to give sort of my takeaways. If I had to sort of sum it up, I'd say the real takeaway from this session is that companies are really at risk of being left behind or becoming obsolete even if they don't do some things like reskilling, rethinking how they train their workforce, how they educate their workforce, using diversity to strengthen that foundation to make your business truly global, and being flexible and willing to take risk and sort of pivot when needed. But I'll let you have the final word. If you had one sort of takeaway or advice, I guess, you give to the room about how to sort of, shape the business in the year to come, what would it be, Francisco?
We are living in an incredible disruptive movement, far more important than people think, in my view. So I would add that I don't like regulation, but I think regulation has to be there. Because at the end of the day, when you are in a disruptive movement, the new companies and the new competencies advance very, very rapidly, but collateral effects are there, bad collateral effects. So it's a question of time that regulators will try to put some order in this new world.
Okay. Thank you, Linda.
I would just share, I think we didn't really touch upon it, particularly for companies that have been around a long time, and what I tell my teams all the time is be less precious about the history or tradition of our company and what we did yesterday, and challenge legacy. Challenge it. Try to actually leave it at the door when you come in the room, because if we don't reinvent, it's going to be really hard to survive moving forward.
Terrific.
Something similar, and maybe in some ways said earlier, is this really challenger mindset or constantly looking almost in a paranoid way to being disrupted is the way I think we'll all have to, at least for businesses, to live. On a personal side, we may have a more peaceful life, but at least for the businesses, that's the way to think about it.
I'd go back to Linda's Me Too example, because I think that is incredibly indicative of the times we're living in. Major issue, society-driven, has huge organizations looking and re-looking at their at things that they're doing with a real-time lens and adjusting on the fly. I mean, insert issue A, that's the world we're living in.
Great. Okay, now on that, I think we'll bring it to a close. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.